Storytelling through the medium of movies and television can often be one of the most complex, most layered means of conveying information. It is truly a multimedia experience, and this combination of spoken word and visual expression, coupled with music and sound design and cinematography and other creative tools, makes for possibilities of certain levels of complexity that other mediums simply cannot accomplish. Writers and directors of film and TV do this all the time, using ideas represented in one layer of the film's media composition to infuse complexity and interest in ideas represented in a separate layer. The most common and basic way this presents itself in film is in music and sound design, where those audible mediums are often used to enhance a particular mood or tone that the visual element is attempting to capture. Another example is in the way directors choose to shoot certain scenes, sometimes using particular angles or framing choices that add a layer on top of other forms of characterization, whether through dialogue or exposition. Sometimes the technique can be quite simple, like adding visual cues to represent certain characteristics or personalities of one particular character, or power dynamics between characters in conversation. Enter this scene in Crazy Rich Asians. In this instance that we're going to talk about today, it's a game being played by two people that, apparently, reflect the dialogue and tension going on between them. Now, some writers and directors go through serious lengths to make sure that tiny details in their movie or television program aren't only interesting, but accurate, even though most times the people who aren't familiar with the details in question don't know any better. As a musician, I encountered this a lot when I witnessed scenes of actors playing musical instruments. An example of this is the performance of Miles Teller in Whiplash, and while most people who don't play the drums or have any understanding of what that level of performance actually looks like and requires tend to just accept it for what it is and follow along the story, I notice every visual stroke that doesn't line up with the music I'm hearing. It's not that I'm trying to nitpick these moments in the movie, it's just that I notice them. It's also because I'm most probably more familiar with the concept being shown on screen than the actor or director is. And so I must begin this by saying that I am quite an enthusiast of the game Mahjong. Many members of my family play it, and so do I. It's something that I have an intimate knowledge of, something that I actually know well enough to teach other people. And so when it shows up on screen, I cannot help but scrutinize it. And so I did. When I first watched Crazy Rich Asians and the Mahjong scene came up, I instinctively paused the movie to see if they had gotten the details right. This kind of attention to detail, if done right, makes me feel a certain level of respect for the writers and directors that really do care. It kind of makes me laugh when they obviously don't, or when they try but still fail miserably. This scene is, well, I don't want to get into it right now, but let's just say that I was curious what other people might have thought about the scene, especially people who knew the game. So I looked it up and came across this exhaustive article on Vox. In it, the writer explains the general ideas behind the game of Mahjong and analyzes it as part of the storytelling complexity I was talking about earlier. According to the article, what happens in the game is pretty reflective of the conversation going on between the two characters and the circumstances they both find themselves in. And that's amazing! If it was true. Okay, look, I'll admit, I'm going to be real petty and nitpicky here. My problem with this whole thing actually isn't with the scene itself. You see, the movie says it got an expert to consult on the game in the scene, and we'll examine and see if this expert is really worth his salt a little later. But it's this Vox article that analyzes the scene as if it were a really detailed and intricate representation of the tension occurring in the dialogue, and then gets a whole bunch of stuff absolutely wrong. Because if the makers of the movie are doing what you say they're doing, they aren't doing it right, and you're telling us that they are. You're analyzing the scene with a poor assumption of the game, thinking that this shows the depth of the scene itself. But more than that, the big brain you have for exposing the intricacies that only an expert could really understand, when you don't actually know what's going on. Okay, pause. To get to my point, I need to explain to you the game. And to add to my Mahjong street cred, I'm going to be using my own tiles! The game of Mahjong is a relatively simple game to start with. There are a total of 136 playable tiles in the game, and anywhere between 8 and 28 additional flower and joker tiles. These will be important later. The playable tiles include 3 suits. In this case, we will call them circles, bamboos, and characters. Side note, it's just a Chinese character for the 10,000 notation. So 1 10,000, 2 10,000, 3 10,000, etc, etc. These suits have 4 tiles each of the numbers 1 to 9. This is the one of bamboo. I don't know why it's historically a bird, it just is. On top of that, we have 4 different wind tiles and 3 different dragon tiles, sometimes referred to together as honor tiles. Again, 4 of each. The game can be played among 3 or 4 players, though the 3-player version has a different set of rules and uses only 1 suit out of the 3. So we'll focus on the 4-player version today because that's the one in the movie. To play the game, the tiles are shuffled and stacked into individual player walls. Then the tiles are drawn in turn until each player has 13 tiles. Players take turns, starting with the person seated at the east wind, again this will be important, and going anti-clockwise, drawing new tiles from the wall and discarding the ones they don't want in an attempt to achieve a winning hand. The aim of the game is to get a complete set of 14 tiles consisting of 4 sets of 3 and then a pair. The sets of 3 can either be a 3 of a kind of a single tile or a sequence of numbers in a particular suit. Now, if it were only that simple, the game would mostly be based on luck, simply going through the movements and seeing what the walls grant you. So we introduce 2 other methods of getting the tiles you want in the game. The first of these is called the Chao, or Qi, or something else depending on the dialect of Chinese. This move means you claim a tile that would complete a sequence of 3, but you can only accept it from the player that goes before you, i.e. the player to your left if we're going anti-clockwise. The player discards the tile and you claim it by placing the now completed sequence in front of your closed hand, and then discard. If a sequence is already complete inside your hand, you don't need to put it out. The second method is called the Pung. This move means you claim a tile that would complete a 3 of a kind, having an existing pair of tiles in your hand. This move, unlike the Chao, can claim tiles from any player's discard once they've done it, and interrupts play, and so players need to call out Pung to indicate that they're claiming the discarded tile if it's not their turn next. There is one other move called the Gong. This move is when a player already has a 3 of a kind and wants to claim the 4th and final tile. The Gong, however, has extra rules to it about whether or not you can interrupt play to claim the tile like the Pung earlier. A Gong can be made by either adding to an existing Pung that you've already done, or by adding onto a Pung that is still inside your closed hand. The former, however, is only applicable if you draw the 4th tile yourself. The latter works like a Pung and interrupts play. Now, there are a lot of extra rules that surround the Gong, but they're not really important right now. But the astute few of you will notice that there is now an irregularity when it comes to the Gong, because if you have a set of 4 tiles for one of your 4 sets, that leaves you 1 tile short if you want to claim victory. So immediately following a Gong, players often receive a replacement tile from the opposite end of the wall. The Gong still counts as a set of 3 that way. Alright, I know it's already getting complicated, but trust me, this is the easy part. And that's the game basically. You go around, you draw and discard, Chao and Pung and Gong your way until you have 4 sets of 3 matching tiles and a pair. When you finally claim a winning tile, you win, or Sek Wu in Cantonese. Then you shuffle the tiles and start all over again. The noise of the tile shuffling is one of those things anyone who's ever heard it can instantly recognize. So with this basic knowledge of the game alone, let's examine the scene as explained by the writer from Vox. We're going to be focusing mainly on the explanation of the game here and what it means, and not really on the scene and the dialogue and the dynamic between the 2 characters, alright? So Vox explains that early on, the character of Eleanor completes a Pung, and this indicates her desire to win using the strategy of matched tiles. Which I assume means all Pungs? But it doesn't though! The fact that she does a Pung does not immediately mean that all her remaining sets now need to be Pungs. She could very well complete her hand with chows if she so desires. In fact, the Pung of the 9 of circles is generally considered a strong choice because it allows for many options of winning, something that we'll talk a lot more about later. You honestly cannot make this assumption based on this one move alone. Vox then goes on to explain that the table sports a bunch of discarded bamboo tiles among some east and west tiles, explaining the significance of this imagery. And while that may be true, it's also something that just naturally happens in the game. If your hand consists mainly of characters and circles, naturally you chuck the bamboos. And also it is incredibly common for players to discard winds that do not belong to them. And so it's highly likely that the east and west winds are on the table because the other two players have discarded them, being on the north and south seats themselves. The seating basically goes like this. East is the dealer, and then to their right is south, and then west, and then north. This will be important later as well. Anyway, moving on. We'll skip ahead. Vox then goes on to say that Rachel draws a winning tile, which is correct, but based on her observation of the game and the fact that she's a game theory professor, she somehow knows this is Eleanor's winning tile too. And this is complete horseshit. There's absolutely no way to know, based on the game that just occurred, that this one particular player, out of the 4 by the way, is also looking for the exact same winning tile. Eleanor has only punged and shown one set out of her 4 required sets, and we see that the game is actually still in its early stages technically, judging by the fact that they've just started playing, but also by the fact that much of the walls of the game are still intact, meaning that there haven't been that many rounds of draws yet. And so, with close to no information regarding the state of the other players' hands, and the fact that there's barely any information about what people might be holding in their hands based on what has already come out, Rachel couldn't have possibly known this. Also, I'll say it again, this is a 4-player game. There's 2 other players here that are affecting the probabilities. Even if you could calculate the probabilities and statistics and come to the conclusion that this 8 bamboo tile is a desirable tile, there's no way to know who wants it, especially if they've shown so little of their hand in the game. Eleanor does in fact pick up the tile and wins because of reasons, and we get Vox telling us about how all this reflects the whole situation that the characters in the film find themselves in. Rachel then reveals her winning hand, and yes, it is a legitimate winning hand, and we get a Vox finale telling us how the scene has an added depth if we understand the game, or something to that effect. Which is all great and lovely, if it weren't for the fact that Mahjong also has... Mahjong, if played according to just the rules I laid out earlier, exists in its simplest form, and is a great way to introduce the game to new players, but that form tends to still lean on large amounts of luck. And so, as an added layer to the complexity and the true strategic and competitive aspect of Mahjong, there's also an incredibly intricate scoring system. It's because of this scoring system that many people tend to say that the game keeps the mind sharp. Mahjong is a game that has a long history, with some dating the creation of the game somewhere in the 1800s. The game is played not just in China, but in a large number of regions including Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and my own country of Malaysia. And each of these communities have their own interpretation of the scoring system. Sometimes even individual households develop house rules, so you could very easily play the same game, but come across a different scoring system from the house right next to you. For the sake of this video though, I'm going to be showcasing what has now come to be known as the Mahjong Competition Rules, or MCR. But I will also showcase one other set of rules later that is applicable to this film and this Vox analysis of it. Now, in order to win a game of Mahjong, one must accumulate points based on the kinds of combinations they achieve in their 4 sets of 3 and the pair. Different combinations, depending on their rarity and probability, have different points associated with them. Most regular games of Mahjong have a minimum limit of points that is required for someone to declare a victory, so yes, there's a possibility that even if you did claim a winning tile, your combinations of winning tiles was simply too pathetic and you didn't score the minimum number of points to actually win. This actually has a term for it and is often called 食詐糊, which basically means claiming a false victory. The common minimum points required to declare a win is 8. Some rules have it set lower for beginners, but generally hovers around that number. This means you have to put some thought into how you win, not just scrambling to see who can get 14 winning tiles the fastest. So how do you score points, you're asking? Well, like this! Yes! There are a total of 82 different ways that you can accumulate points in this game, ranging from things that score you 1 point to full combinations that score you 88 points. And you can even have combinations of several different things out of that list of 82 within the same hand. The theoretical maximum points you can achieve in a single hand in MCR is 337! This scoring system makes the game infinitely more challenging and opens up to hundreds of possibilities for every starting hand to turn into a winning one. Players also tend to aim for higher scoring hands first, and then change their strategies based upon the tiles that get discarded as the game goes along. Sometimes a particularly high scoring hand becomes mathematically impossible based on the discards, and players have to quickly change out to a different winning combination that might score a little lower. Sometimes a winning hand presents itself early on in the game, but players pass on it to try and achieve something bigger, especially when the game is still in its early stages. It's actually pretty common for inexperienced players to get yelled at by more senior players of the game for going only after tiny, easier wins, taking the risk and fun out of the game. And on top of all this, a typical game of Mahjong consists of 16 total rounds, rotating through the players as dealers and also rotating through the wins for the entire table every 4 rounds, so that every win seat has an equal opportunity to gain more points based on... Okay, you know what? This bit isn't important. What is important is that players will often aim for larger hands, because throughout the 16 rounds, one player can be consistently winning small point victories only to be later crushed by a huge single win, ultimately rendering them a loser after all 16 rounds have been played. And with this knowledge now, let's go back to some of the nonsense that this Vox article presents. Let's go back to the opening move by Eleanor, the Pung of the 9 of Circles. This is why I said earlier that it's often considered a decent move, especially in the early portions of the game, because it retains several high scoring possibilities. She could, for instance, be aiming for the upper 3 tiles win, only using 7s, 8s and 9s, giving her a total of 24 points. Or she could be going for Pungs that consist only of terminal tiles, 1s and 9s, and dragons and wins, which also generates 24 points. Or she could just be playing a full flush, using only circle tiles to win, which also gets you 24 points. The fact is that this opening is strong because it retains these high scoring possibilities throughout the game. On the other hand, a move like chowing the 2-3-4 bamboo tiles, for instance, means you lock yourself very quickly into only very few high scoring hands, and mainly confine yourself to small scoring hands like maybe a mixed triple chow, which is 8 points. That would be considered a weaker move in the opening moments of the game, and in general, most players avoid doing this even when the opportunity presents itself. And so, to simply state that Eleanor's opening immediately pegs her into playing something that requires all Pungs is simply not true and shows actually a very poor and lacking understanding of the game. Even if she did accomplish all Pungs, by the way, if it was an assortment of suits and numbers and other things, it would still only score her 6 points, not even enough to win on its own. This, by the way, is also why I said earlier it is common for players to discard win tiles, because the high scoring hands that involve the win tiles often require more than just one of them. A single Pung of a win that doesn't belong to you simply lands you 1 point. A Pung of your own seat's win only scores you 2. Only when you Pung like 3 wins do you start to climb up the scorecards and land yourself 12 points. So if you've only got a single win tile, you're more than likely going to chuck it. Also, the number of high scoring hands that include wins in them is actually much smaller, once again locking yourself into fewer possible winning combinations if you play it too early. And also, all win and dragon tiles cannot be chowed, which means it's highly unlikely that a player would hold on to just a single one of them in hopes of drawing another, and then drawing another or claiming a discard to Pung it, all for just 2 points. So far, the scoring system I've been showing you is called MCR, Mahjong Competition Rules, but as I mentioned, regional rules also exist, and would you know it, Singapore actually has its own set of rules, and since that's where the movie's set in, we'll have to take a look at it. Now, I must confess that I'm not very well versed in the Singaporean scoring system, but I can tell you the basics. The Singaporean scoring system is largely similar to the MCR. However, it tends to deal with a smaller set of values, with the score values usually between 1 and 10. For instance, a Dragon Pung is worth 1 point, and an all Pung hand earns 2 points instead of 6. Bigger hands like a full flush earn 4 points instead of 24 in MCR. And a really ridiculous hand like the 13 Orphans hand or Sapsam Yu hand scores 13 points, or the limit, which is the maximum number of points agreed upon before the start of the game, whichever is the smaller number. There are some scoring methods in MCR that do not exist at all in Singapore rules, meaning that the possibilities of earning points are in fact smaller. The foundational concept, however, is still vastly similar, in that combinations that are rarer and harder to achieve then tend to be higher scoring. So the same ideas apply. Certain moves tend to lead to more high scoring possibilities, so most of the things that I've already said still apply. The Vox article shows us one thing, and even the writers and director of this movie, if they were indeed trying to show us what the Vox article claims they were trying to show us with this game, also show us the same thing. This scene analysis only really works if your understanding of the game of Mahjong is as simple as win or lose, without understanding the real core of the game that exists within its intricate scoring system. So why am I saying all this? It's not to say that the filmmakers made a mistake, or that they're only taking Mahjong at such a superficial level, but it's really to say that the conclusion in the Vox article, the conclusion that the game being played in front of us is really a reflection of the situation of the characters, that analysis is total bullshit. Okay, even if they did indeed nail it on the head, and that's exactly what the filmmakers were trying to achieve, which I doubt, then the filmmakers also done goofed. But if not, then this Vox article clearly doesn't know what they're talking about and are trying to seem as if they're geniuses or something for seeing this complex relationship between the scene and the game. And as a Mahjong player, I hate this shit. So let me go a little deeper and do an actual proper analysis of the game here for you to see. Now, as I've already mentioned, it is almost impossible to have any kind of actual analysis of the game played in full because we're shown so little of what happens. We're shown the starting hand that Eleanor had, her winning hand, Rachel's winning hand, Eleanor's early Pung, and that's it. So any kind of Vox level analysis is impossible and absolute crap. We can, however, analyze the final winning hands to see if the movie did indeed have any level of complex understanding of the game beyond the basic win-lose idea that seems to be at play here. So let us do the one thing that a real Mahjong player can do and look at the scores. Let's start with Singapore rules. Eleanor's hand scores, and that's it. I may have missed something since I don't personally play Singapore rules, but it's generally a pretty small hand, I think. 3 points. Rachel's win, on the other hand, scores, bringing the total to a hefty 4 points. Wow. As you can see, if we implement scoring into the game being shown here, it actually kind of makes the game seem a little lame points-wise. And it does kind of reflect that both the scene itself and the Vox article analysis of it fail to take into account the scoring aspect of Mahjong entirely, losing any real depth that the actual game of Mahjong has to offer. The scene actually trivializes the game into simple win-lose mechanics, making it less impactful than it could have been. If Rachel, for instance, had been holding on to a ridiculously powerful hand, one of those hands that is considered a limit hand, maximum points in Singaporean Mahjong rules, and Eleanor's hand had remained small and pathetic, that would actually enhance the characterization here even more. It would demonstrate that... Wait, hang on, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's give the movie's supposed Mahjong expert another chance to redeem themselves and take a look at the less likely possibility that they were playing MCR rules. Eleanor's winning hand scores for a grand total of 15 points. In the great words of Dyatlov, not great, not terrible. Rachel's hand scores now that's a much more respectable win of 28 points. See, if the movie's expert had been creating this scene according to the MCR scoring system, the scene actually becomes even better. The fact that Eleanor is so proud of her win, despite the fact that it's relatively small and achieves very little, shows that she was only interested in winning quickly, trying to assert herself in the situation, not realizing she's coming off as petty and small. It gels really well with her character, feeling like she's in control, holding the winning hand, but failing to realize that even if she may have won, her victory is nothing compared to what Rachel would have gained if she won. The sacrifice Rachel is making feels so much more powerful if the winning hand is much bigger, and in this instance, it is. Rachel's declaration of a large winning hand shows that she views herself as the bigger person here and really sticks it to Eleanor. The imagery is so much more powerful in this instance, and it really does become one of those movie Easter eggs that only the Mahjong literate will understand. So the movie expert actually did know what they were doing here. Well done! Well, except for one more thing. There is one more thing we can infer about the supposed expertise that went into the crafting of this Mahjong scene. While the final scores do lend some credence to the scene being created specifically to represent the characterization we're seeing through the dialogue and circumstance, assuming of course we score according to MCR, there's a lot more that kinda proves that even the movie expert doesn't understand Mahjong beyond the simple win-lose mechanic. Firstly, we've already shown that nothing special really shows itself in the scene if we apply the lens of Singapore rules to the game. And since the movie itself is set in Singapore, it hints that the movie expert might not even have known that Singapore players have their own set of rules and scoring. Secondly, and this is a big one, the hand that Eleanor starts with and the hand that she ends up winning with is a highly improbable occurrence. We're shown here that her hand at the moment she ponged the 9 of circles consists mostly of circles, and at the end her hand is a mixed bag of stuff. Not only that, but her hand consists of 2 concealed pongs, which meant that she had to draw all 6 of those tiles. The chances of this happening are so slim, but on top of that, the choice to do this for Eleanor to discard all her circle tiles in favor of something like this is absurd, especially after she already ponged the 9 of circles. A full flush hand, a hand consisting of all circle tiles, is the far more likely choice to victory if her hand is already largely circles, and that would have earned her 4 points in Singapore rules and a hefty 24 in MCR. Only an idiot would play like that. And lastly, Rachel's winning hand, despite it being relatively large already in MCR, could have been far superior if she had chosen instead not to mix her pongs with a chow, again showing that she was clearly not aiming for a larger win when she very easily could have. We're still in Singapore rules, a fully concealed hand earns only 1 point if it consists of a mixture of pongs and chows, but a fully concealed hand, if only consisting of pongs, is actually a limit hand, the maximum number of points. Just a small tweak would have given Rachel an absolutely dominating hand. The game of Mahjong is awesome. It's a complex game of calculating probabilities and assessing risk and chance, offensive and defensive moves, a game that requires quick and sharp minds to make on-the-spot analyses of the current state of play and change their game plans accordingly. It's such a rich and deep game. Just watch any World Series of Mahjong video with commentary and you'll see how intensely strategic the game actually is. And all this could have actually been given its full due in this scene. The fact that Rachel folds a winning hand and Eleanor wins is enough to convey the story on a surface level, but the real details could have been put in there too, and not taken away from the impact the scene already has on people unfamiliar with the game. but it would instead reveal to those with a real understanding of the game a level of depth and detail that some of the greatest filmmakers go to extreme lengths to achieve. It could have been one of those incredible pieces of trivia that not only elevates the movie, but elevates the depiction of the game in media. Think of all the times movies and TV have gotten your thing wrong, and this unfortunately just joins that list. I hope I've given you a glimpse of what real Mahjong can be, and maybe one day you'll try the game for yourself. Also, don't believe articles like these just because they pretend like they know so much and pretend as if there's depth to something when there isn't. And you people that write this shit, just stop already. Okay, thanks, bye. By the way, fun fact, I'm in this movie!